My name is Lorraine. I'm a 53-year-old mother who raised her son with everything she had. I worked 2 jobs, sold my wedding ring once to pay his school fee, and never complained. So when I saw the photos of his wedding online, my hands went cold. There he was, smiling in a suit I had bought him, standing next to the woman who once called me Mama. I hadn't even known there was a wedding. They did it without me. But what they didn't expect was that I still had something they both needed, something that would change everything. The morning I saw those photos, the sky outside was gray but quiet. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone. My cousin had tagged me by mistake, thinking I was already there. I stared at the picture for so long that the screen dimmed twice. My son looked happy, his hand around her waist, both of them glowing in that expensive camera light. It felt like I was looking at strangers who had borrowed my child and forgot to return him. I sat there for a long time, trying to tell myself it didn't matter. Maybe they had a small ceremony. Maybe it wasn't official yet. I refreshed the page again, and there it was. The caption that ended every excuse I could invent. Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Davis, my son's name, bold and clear. Married, without me. My stomach felt hollow, like I'd missed a step going down a staircase. I wasn't angry yet, just quiet, like my emotions had turned into fog. Something inside me whispered that there was more to this story. I remembered when that girl first walked into my house. She had soft eyes and nervous hands, the kind that held onto her purse like it might float away. I made her cornbread, and she called me Mama that same night. I liked her. I wanted her to feel welcome, because I knew what it meant to walk into someone else's world. For months, she'd come by with flowers, always smiling, always sweet. I thought she was the kind of woman who'd build a family, not break one apart. But people change when the light hits them differently. When the engagement was announced, she was polite but distant. She stopped visiting without reason, and my son's calls got shorter. He'd say he was tired, busy, stressed. I knew better. He wasn't tired of work. He was tired of balancing 2 worlds, hers and mine. I could feel it slipping, the way you can feel a storm before it breaks. But I stayed calm. I prayed. I told myself love has its seasons, and maybe I just needed to wait for spring again. I didn't know winter had already settled in. My house grew quieter every week. No knocks at the door, no shoes by the mat, no laughter from the kitchen, just me, my tea, and the hum of the refrigerator. I tried calling one night and got voicemail. The next morning I tried again, and this time the number was disconnected. I told myself, maybe he changed phones, but deep down I knew the truth. You can't lose a number by accident. You can, however, erase one when someone tells you to. That realization settled in my chest like heavy stone. When I saw her smirk in that wedding photo, something clicked. It wasn't the smile of happiness, it was victory. It said, I won. And I don't know what game she thought she was playing, but I wasn't going to sit back and pretend I didn't see the scoreboard. I didn't raise my son to forget who he was or where he came from. That girl thought she'd closed the book on me, but she didn't know I kept the first chapter locked away, with every detail she could never rewrite. That's where my plan began. I went to my old cabinet, the one with the uneven drawer that sticks when it rains. Inside was a wooden box I hadn't opened in years. It held a few keepsakes from my late husband, his watch, his ring, and one envelope. The envelope had his handwriting, strong, neat, still alive somehow. It was sealed the day before he passed. I had never opened it. He told me once that it was for our boy, when the time comes. I had waited for that time, and now I knew it had arrived, just not the way I expected. I sat on the couch, holding that letter against my heart. It felt like it carried a pulse of its own. My husband had been a quiet man, the kind who didn't speak unless his words had purpose. If he left something behind, it mattered. I thought of opening it right then, but something told me not to. The moment didn't feel ready. I placed it beside his ring instead and looked at both like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't yet solved. I whispered his name and asked him to guide me one more time. When I finally opened the letter that night, I read slowly, like each word carried weight. My husband wrote about the house by the river, the one where our son took his first steps. He mentioned a key, and something about a promise that must be kept. He ended with a line that stayed in my mind. When love forgets its roots, remind it where it grew. I didn't fully understand, but I knew that key wasn't just metal. It was meaning, and I had kept it all these years. Wrapped in ribbon, waiting. I found the small key in a drawer near the window. It was tied with faded blue ribbon, the same shade my husband wore on our wedding day. I held it in my hand and smiled without joy. That girl had her wedding without me. But she didn't have this. She didn't even know it existed. It wasn't money or property. It was legacy, something deeper than any gift you can buy. I looked around my quiet house and realized it was time to remind them both what family really means. The next morning, I packed a small bag, just a few clothes, my Bible, and that box. The bus schedule hung on my fridge, same as always, because I like being prepared even for the trips I never take. I called my neighbor, told her to keep an eye on the house. She asked where I was going, and I just said to finish something that should have been done right. I didn't tell her about the letter. Some things aren't for sharing until they reach their end. The bus ride to the city took hours, but it gave me time to think. I watched the rain streak the windows, forming rivers that blurred the world outside. I thought about my boy, how small his hands once were, how proud I'd been of every step he took. Somewhere between those memories, I began to understand the girl. Maybe she thought I was competition. Maybe she didn't want reminders of where he came from. But no matter what she believed, she had forgotten that love doesn't erase people, it adds to them. When the bus reached the station, the city lights felt too bright for my eyes. Everything looked sharp and loud. I walked to their apartment building, holding my umbrella like armor. The guard at the gate asked who I was visiting. I gave my name, but he couldn't find it on the list. I almost laughed. I told him I'd raised the man upstairs and didn't need permission to see my own child. Something in my tone made him step aside. Sometimes the truth walks in on its own authority. Their building smelled of fresh paint and new money. My footsteps echoed through the hallway as I found the right door. I stood there for a moment, steadying myself, then pressed the doorbell. My son opened it. His face froze. He looked like a boy caught doing something wrong, not a man starting his life. Behind him she appeared, perfect hair, calm face, eyes that studied me like I was an uninvited thought. I said I came to congratulate them. She smiled that same smirk from the photo and stepped aside. The air in their apartment was cold, like a hotel room, beautiful but empty. My son tried to make small talk, but I could see the strain in his eyes. The girl crossed her arms, acting polite but waiting for me to leave. I didn't. I placed my bag on the table, opened the wooden box, and set the key on top of it. Her smile faded a little. I told them I came not to visit, but to finish something their wedding forgot. She raised an eyebrow, confused. My son just stared, unsure what I meant. Her smirk reminded me of someone who thought they had already won. It wasn't the face of joy. It was pride dressed as politeness. I looked at her and saw a woman who thought marriage meant ownership. She thought taking my son's name meant erasing his roots. I didn't argue. I just studied that expression, calm and quiet. People like her expect noise, not silence. Silence makes them nervous. I let her sit in it, shifting in her seat while I held my peace. I wanted her to wonder what I knew that she didn't. My son asked if I wanted tea. His voice careful like he was walking on glass. I told him no, I wasn't staying long. The girl tilted her head, pretending to be kind, but her eyes stayed sharp. I told them both that I came to deliver something their wedding missed. My son frowned, but she leaned back like she was bored. She didn't know what was coming, and that gave me strength. My husband always said, people reveal themselves when they think they're safe. I was watching her reveal everything, without saying a word. I pulled out the letter and placed it beside the key. My son's eyes widened. He recognized his father's handwriting. He reached for it, but I told him to wait. The girl leaned closer, curious now. I said this letter was meant for the day my son got married, written by his father before he passed. The girl blinked, unsure what to say. I could see her calculating, wondering if this was about money. She didn't realize the value wasn't something she could spend. It was something she could lose forever. I opened the letter and read a few lines out loud. My husband wrote about the importance of blessings, about how no union built on pride could stand. He wrote that love without roots becomes hollow. My son looked uneasy, glancing between us. The girl forced a smile, saying it sounded old-fashioned. I didn't answer her. I folded the letter again and told her some words age like wine, others rot like milk. She didn't understand yet which kind her attitude belonged to. My son just looked down, ashamed. I took the key and placed it in my son's hand. It was small, wrapped in faded ribbon. I told him it opened the door to the house by the river, our first home, the one his father rebuilt after the flood. His eyes softened. That place held memories of simpler times. The girl spoke up, saying they sold that house years ago. I shook my head. No, I said. You sold what you thought was yours, but this key still fits somewhere you forgot. She frowned, confused, her confidence starting to fade. I explained that his father's will had one condition: the home and its inheritance couldn't transfer without a family blessing given in person. No phone calls, no letters, no stand-ins, just family. The girl laughed lightly, thinking I was bluffing. My son didn't laugh. He knew his father well enough to believe it. I told them I hadn't given that blessing yet. The room grew still, and for the first time, the girl's smile looked forced. She shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between me and the key. She tried to change the subject, asking how I'd been. It was a clumsy move, and my son noticed. I said I'd been fine, just surprised to see a wedding I wasn't invited to. My voice didn't rise. I spoke evenly, like someone telling a fact that couldn't be denied. She opened her mouth to explain, but my son stopped her. He said he thought I wouldn't want to travel. That hurt more than any insult. He had assumed my absence instead of asking for my presence. That's how you erase a mother without saying her name. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes rest on both of them. My silence was heavier than any argument could be. I told them I came not to fight, but to remind. Some things in life can't be rewritten, no matter how many papers you sign. I told them that house by the river wasn't just a building, it carried generations of prayer. My husband poured every ounce of love into those walls, and the blessing was the lock that kept it alive. Without it, the home stays empty, no matter who claims it. The girl tried to act unfazed, pretending to look at her phone, but I saw her knuckles tighten around it. I told her it wasn't about money or ownership, it was about honor. When people forget who helped them rise, they fall faster than they climbed. I said it gently, not as a threat, but as truth. My son lowered his head, and for a second, I thought he might cry. That was when I knew he still had a piece of his father inside him, buried under her pride. I took the ring from the box, the same ring my husband wore for 25 years. I held it up and said this was meant for my son on his wedding day. I'd saved it for that moment. The girl's eyes flicked toward it, curious. I told them both that I had planned to bless their union with that ring, so they would start with something real, something earned. But since that moment was taken from me, the blessing was never passed. Without it, everything they had built was missing its foundation. My son looked like he wanted to speak, but the words never came. The girl finally asked what exactly the blessing meant in legal terms. Her voice cracked slightly. I told her the blessing was part of the inheritance clause. Without it, ownership of the river house couldn't transfer, and any related assets were frozen. That made her face pale. She turned toward my son, whispering something. I didn't need to hear it. I already knew what she was thinking. Some lessons are taught with silence, and she was starting to understand that. I stood up and said I didn't come to argue or demand. I just wanted to honor my husband's last request. My son followed me to the door, asking if we could talk later. I said he could call any time, as long as it was him calling, not her speaking through him. He nodded weakly. The girl stood by the kitchen. her hands clasped together. She didn't smirk this time. She looked uneasy, like the ground under her wasn't as solid as she thought. I left the letter on the table beside the key. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. I could see my reflection in the mirrored wall, calm, older, but not defeated. Outside, the rain had started again, soft but steady. I pulled my umbrella open and stepped into the street. Every raindrop felt like punctuation, closing a sentence I had been holding on to for years. My shoes splashed through shallow puddles as I walked toward the bus stop. I didn't look back. Some moments don't need witnesses to have meaning. They just need courage to be walked away from. The bus was nearly empty when I boarded. I sat near the window, clutching my bag close. The city lights blurred into ribbons as the bus moved. I thought about my son and wondered when he started seeing me as a guest instead of home. That thought stung, but it didn't break me. I told myself that pain can be a teacher when pride becomes blind. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to him now. I leaned back and listened to the rain tap on the glass like an old song. Halfway through the ride, I pulled out the letter again. I read the final lines slowly. My husband had written something I'd missed earlier. If love forgets its blessing, time will remind it. Those words hit deep. Maybe that's what was happening now. Time was reminding them, through me. I smiled faintly and tucked the letter away. Then I whispered to myself that forgiveness and distance can live together when the heart learns its boundaries. That bus ride felt like the start of something new, even if it came wrapped in heartbreak. Before we move further, I want to pause here for a second. This story is one that carries a lot of heart and truth, and if you're still listening, it means you understand that kind of love. If you do, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps me share more stories like this one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like these connect us all, no matter where we are. Now, let's get back to what happened after that bus ride home. The next morning, I woke up early. The air felt cleaner after the night of rain. I made coffee and sat near the window, watching the street slowly come alive. I kept replaying yesterday's visit in my head, not to regret it, but to understand it. I realized that silence had been my strength. I didn't need to shout to be heard. Truth speaks for itself. I opened my Bible and placed the letter inside it, like a bookmark. I whispered a small prayer for my son, not for change, but for clarity. By afternoon, the quiet felt peaceful again. I watered my plants and folded laundry. My small routines grounded me. My mind kept wandering to the quay and the house by the river. I wondered if they would go see it. That house held everything my family ever stood for: love, work, and second chances. My husband had once said, "Homes remember who loved them." I hoped that if my son stepped inside again, the walls would remind him of that love, even if my words couldn't reach him directly. Later that evening, I walked to the corner store. The owner, Mr. Harlan, asked where I'd been lately. I just smiled and said I took a small trip. He asked if it was good news or bad. I said it was both. He nodded, like he understood. On my way home, I passed the church. The bell rang in the distance, that familiar sound echoing across the street. It reminded me that everything finds its rhythm again, even broken hearts. The sound of that bell stayed in my ears long after I got home. I sat at the kitchen table with a candle burning beside me. It was the same candle I'd lit the night my husband passed away. It had never burned all the way down. Somehow, it always stopped halfway. I used to think that meant unfinished business. That night, the flame flickered steady, stronger than usual. I took it as a sign that something had shifted. I didn't know if my son would call, but I knew I'd said everything I needed to. Peace doesn't always come from winning. Sometimes it comes from walking away, right? Days went by, and no one called. I went about my chores, tended my garden, and visited the local market. The silence didn't hurt anymore. It just existed. Each night, I'd read a bit of the letter again, not for answers, but comfort. My husband's words reminded me that love and distance could coexist. People think closure means reunion, but sometimes it means learning to live without needing it. I began to understand that my son had his path, and I had mine. both could still lead to peace. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. My name was written in my son's handwriting, shaky but careful. Inside, he wrote that he had read the letter again and visited the river house. He said walking through those rooms felt like hearing his father's voice again. He realized how much he had drifted from who he used to be. He ended the letter by saying he wanted to visit me soon, with his wife. I set the letter down and just smiled. Some lessons don't need words. Time teaches them better than we ever could. The next morning, I cleaned the house. Not because anyone asked me to, but because my heart wanted to make space. I took out the good dishes, washed the curtains, and baked cornbread. It wasn't excitement. It was gratitude. I didn't know how the visit would go, but I wanted the door open, both literally and emotionally. My husband used to say that love is like air. It fills the room you make for it. That day, I opened every window. The breeze carried the faint smell of rain, and for the first time in weeks, I felt light. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I didn't rush. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked slowly to the door. My son stood there, holding flowers. Behind him, his wife looked nervous but soft. They both looked younger somehow, humbled. I smiled and stepped aside. No words, just welcome. The house felt alive again, as if it had been waiting for this moment. They sat at the table, and I poured them tea. I noticed her eyes kept glancing toward the wooden box on the counter. She remembered it. We sat in a quiet that didn't feel heavy anymore. My son thanked me for visiting them, and said he understood now. He said the house by the river wasn't just a place, it was a lesson. The girl nodded, saying she wanted to earn her place in this family, not take it. Her voice trembled a little, but it was honest. I looked at both of them and saw something returning, something real. I said, "Then let's start again." And for the first time in months, the silence around us felt like peace. After they left that first afternoon, I sat for a long time at the table. The flowers they brought were still in their plastic wrap, but they smelled real, clean. I poured another cup of tea and thought about how quiet forgiveness feels. It doesn't shout or demand an answer. It just sits there, waiting for you to notice it. I didn't know if they'd come back again, but I could feel something soft in the air, like a page being turned. It wasn't an ending anymore. It felt like a pause before a better chapter. The next day, I received a message from my son asking if they could come over for dinner. I smiled and told him yes. This time, I didn't prepare with worry. I prepared with peace. I seasoned the chicken, cleaned the silverware, and played a little jazz on the radio. When they arrived, the house already smelled like home. The girl offered to help in the kitchen, and though she moved carefully, I could tell she meant it. Sometimes, sincerity hides in small gestures. She was trying, and that was enough for me to try too. Over dinner, the conversation stayed simple: work, weather, old memories. Nothing deep, nothing dangerous. My son laughed more than he had in months. I saw the way he looked at his wife. It wasn't guilt anymore, it was understanding. She asked me about my late husband, what he was like as a father. I told her he was the kind of man who believed respect had to live inside love, or it wasn't real. She nodded, quiet. I didn't need to explain further. I could tell she understood that those words were meant for her too. After they left, I sat by the window again. The candle still burning. The flame was shorter now but steady. I realized how much had changed in just a few days. Anger used to fill the space between us like smoke. Now it felt like clean air. My husband used to say healing never looks like what you expect. I understood that now. It wasn't about apologies or inheritance or even the wedding. It was about remembering that family doesn't stay broken when love refuses to leave. That thought carried me into sleep that night. The next morning, I took a walk to the church by the corner. The bell was ringing again, echoing softly through the streets. I stepped inside for the first time in months. The air smelled of candles and old wood. I knelt and prayed, not for justice or revenge, but for wisdom. I asked for the strength to keep my heart open. Pride had cost me enough already. When I left, I felt lighter. The kind of lightness that doesn't mean forgetting. It means no longer carrying what isn't yours. That was my quiet gift to myself. When I got home, the phone was ringing. It was my son. He said he and his wife wanted to visit the river house again, to fix it up together. He asked if I'd come along. My first instinct was to say no, but then I remembered my husband's letter, the part about reminding love where it grew. I told my son I'd think about it. When I hung up, I looked at the box on the shelf. The key was still there, waiting. Maybe the lesson wasn't about holding on. Maybe it was about handing over. That evening, I sat outside on the porch, watching the sunset stretch across the sky. The neighborhood kids were playing, their laughter floating through the air. I thought about time, how it changes everything, how it heals and hurts at the same time. My husband's voice felt close, like a memory you can almost touch. I told him softly that I was ready to let go, but not of love, just the pain. The wind blew through the trees, carrying the sound of distant bells again. It felt like an answer, quiet but clear. A few days later, my son drove down with his wife to pick me up. The ride to the river house was quiet at first. The road twisted through fields and trees that looked older than memory. My son reached for my hand halfway there. I didn't pull away. I could tell he needed that touch, maybe more than he realized. His wife sat in the back, holding a small bouquet of wild flowers. When we arrived, the house stood tall, a little worn but proud, like it had been waiting for us. The key fit perfectly. Walking inside felt like stepping into time. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of dust and wood. Sunlight poured through the broken shutters in long golden lines. Every creak of the floor felt familiar, like footsteps from years ago. My son ran his hand over the walls, tracing cracks like old scars. His wife stood quietly near the fireplace, her eyes glistening. I opened the windows wide, letting the air in. The place breathed again. Homes, like hearts, don't die. They just wait for someone to remember them. We spent the day cleaning, sweeping, scrubbing the walls. It felt good to work together again. Every small task became a kind of healing. My son repaired the old clock that hadn't ticked in years. His wife dusted off family photos she'd never seen before. I found one of my husband holding our son as a baby. I placed it on the mantel. That picture reminded me that everything worth saving takes effort. I realized then that forgiveness isn't a gift you give once. It's something you keep choosing, day after day, like breathing. By evening, the house looked alive again. We sat on the porch with lemonade, watching the sun sink behind the trees. My son thanked me for coming, for not giving up on them. His wife added that she understood now why I'd been so hurt. She said she had been afraid of not measuring up, so she tried to erase me instead. I didn't say much. I just told her, fear makes fools out of the best people. She nodded and looked down, the wild flowers still in her lap. The air between us felt honest. When the stars came out, we lit the fireplace. The crackling filled the silence. I pulled out the wooden box one last time. I took the ring and held it toward my son. He hesitated, but then reached for it. I placed it in his hand and said softly that it belonged there now. He didn't speak. He just closed his fingers around it. His wife looked at him with quiet respect. That ring wasn't just a symbol, it was the weight of everything his father had taught him. The room glowed warm with acceptance. We stayed the night in the river house. The sound of crickets filled the dark. I couldn't sleep much, but it didn't bother me. I walked to the window and looked out at the river shining under the moon. I thought about how far we had come, not in miles but in understanding. Pain had been our teacher, patience, our bridge. I realized I no longer carried anger. It had burned itself out and left room for peace. I whispered a thank you to my husband, wherever he was, and closed my eyes with a calm heart. Morning light crept into the room, soft and golden. I woke to the smell of breakfast cooking downstairs. My son was at the stove, humming a tune his father used to sing. His wife was setting the table, careful and quiet. I watched them for a moment before joining in. It felt normal, easy, like we had returned to something we didn't know we'd lost. When we sat down to eat, my son looked at me and said it felt like home again. I smiled and told him it always was. It just needed its people back. After breakfast, we went outside. The grass was long, and the air smelled of dew. My son suggested planting something new, a tree for his father. We found a small spot near the fence and dug a hole together. His wife placed the wildflowers into the soil first. Then we added a sapling beside them. I said a short prayer, asking for strength and unity. When we finished, I felt like we'd built more than just a memory. We'd built a promise, a living reminder that love doesn't disappear. It changes form and keeps growing. Before we left, I walked through each room one last time. I touched the walls and the door frames, remembering the laughter that once filled them. My son followed me, quiet, just watching. When we reached the front door, he said he wanted to move back here someday, to raise his children where he was raised. My heart warmed at those words. I told him the house would always be waiting for him, the same way I always did. He smiled, and for the first time, I saw my husband's spirit in his face again. The ride home was peaceful. The road shimmered under the sunlight, and the windows were rolled down, letting in the breeze. My son and his wife talked softly in the front seat. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I wasn't tired. I was full. Life had given me more than I asked for, not in comfort, but in closure. The sound of the tires on the road reminded me of a heartbeat, steady and calm. Everything felt right again. Not perfect, not polished, just right, and that was enough for me. When I got home, I placed the empty wooden box back on the shelf. It no longer carried pain, it carried peace. I lit the candle again, its small flame steady as always. The room felt alive, but in a softer way now. I poured myself tea and sat at the table, listening to the same church bell from down the street. It rang 5 times, echoing through the walls. I smiled, knowing my story had come full circle. Sometimes, blessings aren't spoken, they're lived. Mine was sitting right there in the quiet. That week, I started journaling again. I wrote about everything. My husband, my son, the letter, the house. I wanted to remember how healing actually looked, not how people imagine it. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was steady, patient, slow, like sunlight finding its way through curtains. Writing it down helped me see that I didn't lose anything. I just rediscovered what mattered. I wrote that love isn't about being invited to every moment. It's about being remembered when the right moment comes. And in that sense, I was never truly left out. My days returned to their rhythm, gardening, reading, visiting the store. But everything felt softer now. Even the neighbors noticed. Mrs. Carter said, "I looked peaceful lately." I told her peace doesn't come to you. You have to meet it halfway. She smiled, though I'm not sure she understood. But that was fine. Some lessons can't be explained. They have to be lived. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. My story wasn't about what they did. It was about how I decided to end it, and I chose grace over anger. Every single time. One afternoon, while folding clothes, I found the bus ticket from that day. It had slipped into my coat pocket. I held it for a long time, remembering the woman who rode that bus, hurt, but determined. She didn't know what peace looked like then, only that she needed to find it. I smiled at the thought. I placed the ticket inside the wooden box, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of courage. Sometimes, the hardest journeys don't take miles, they just take heart, and I knew I had walked mine fully. A few days later, I got a phone call. It was my son again. He said he and his wife were planning to renew their vows properly, this time with family present. He asked if I would bless them. My chest tightened in the best way. I told him yes, not because I needed the moment, but because it was his turn to complete the story. The sound of his voice carried warmth again. We talked for hours. I hung up smiling, realizing that what was once broken had finally learned how to bend without breaking. The morning of the vow renewal, I stood in front of the mirror and pinned my hair the way my husband liked. I wore the same necklace I'd worn on my wedding day. When I arrived, everyone greeted me with hugs. My son looked proud, his wife radiant but humble. The ceremony was small, simple, beautiful. When it was time for the blessing, I stepped forward. I placed my hands on theirs and whispered a prayer my husband once taught me. The air felt warm, and for a second I could almost feel him standing beside me. After the ceremony, people laughed and ate under the open sky. My son and his wife danced to a soft song playing from a small speaker. I sat quietly at a nearby table, just watching. A few guests came over to thank me for raising such a kind man. I smiled and told them kindness doesn't happen by accident. It's taught through example. In that moment, I realized my years of struggle hadn't gone to waste. Every sacrifice, every lonely night, had led to this peace, not perfection. That was my real reward. When the sun began to set, I stood up and walked toward the edge of the yard. The air smelled of grass and food, laughter floating around me. My son came and hugged me tightly. He said, "I'm glad you came." I told him I never really left. Family isn't about being there for every moment. It's about never letting go of the bond that connects you. As he walked back to his wife, I looked at the sky and whispered to my husband that our boy had finally found his way home. That night, after the vow renewal, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every face I had seen, every smile, every laugh. It felt unreal that we had come this far. The candle on my bedside table was still burning, small but steady. I thought about how it had outlasted storms, loneliness, and grief, yet it never went out. Maybe that's what love truly is, something that doesn't die when forgotten, just waits to be remembered. I blew out the candle softly, knowing that its light now lived inside all of us. The next morning, my son called just to check on me. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything. He said they were driving to the river house again for the weekend. Just the two of them. He wanted to repaint the porch and fix the old swing. I smiled, picturing it. That house had gone from a memory to a future again. It felt like my husband's plan had worked in ways even he couldn't have imagined. I hung up feeling proud, not for what I'd done, but for who my son had become. As the days passed, my house filled with a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. The walls didn't echo anymore. They held warmth. I started cooking new recipes, listening to music again, even humming along. The smallest things, like sunlight through the curtains, felt like blessings. My neighbors noticed I was smiling more. They didn't know why, but they didn't have to. Some joy can't be explained. It's built quietly, brick by brick, from lessons learned the hard way. I had walked through heartbreak and come out softer, not bitter. That was victory to me. One Sunday afternoon, I went through my old photo albums. There were pictures of birthdays, church gatherings, my husband fixing the fence, and my son laughing in the mud. Each photo told a story I had forgotten to cherish. I realized how much time I had spent looking at what was lost instead of what was lived. I closed the album and promised myself I wouldn't do that again. The past didn't need fixing. It only needed honoring. That simple truth settled deep in my heart, like peace finding its rightful seat. I started attending church again every week. The congregation had changed a lot since I last went. There were new faces, new voices in the choir, but the same old spirit. During one service, the pastor spoke about forgiveness being the key that opens doors even when others try to lock them. Those words felt like they were meant for me. I held the little blue ribbon from the key in my pocket and smiled. The blessing I once guarded so tightly was never meant to stay locked away. It was meant to be shared. A month later, my son came to visit alone. He said his wife was at a work retreat, but sent her love. He brought me a small box wrapped neatly in gold paper. Inside was a photo frame with our family picture, the one from their vow renewal. On the back it said, "Thank you for reminding us where we come from." I didn't say much, just hugged him. That frame wasn't just a picture. It was a bridge between generations, the kind you can cross both ways, as long as love stays steady. We spent the afternoon talking about life, bills, and small things. Nothing dramatic, just conversation that felt easy again. He asked if I was lonely. I told him I wasn't. I had company now, even in silence. He nodded and said he finally understood what his father meant by quiet strength. That phrase stayed with me long after he left. Quiet strength. Maybe that's what my journey had always been about. Not proving anyone wrong, but showing what endurance and love can build when the world forgets how to. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the houses, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The air was cool, and kids played across the street. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like life was something I had to survive. It felt like something I got to live again. I thought about the younger me, the one who worried too much about being included, about being seen. I wished I could tell her that peace doesn't come from being invited. It comes from knowing your worth, never needed permission. A few weeks later, I received a surprise package in the mail. It was from my daughter-in-law. Inside was a small glass snow globe. It had a tiny house by a river inside, surrounded by trees. The base was missing, but the globe still stood upright. There was a note attached. Some things don't need fixing to be beautiful. I stared at it for a long time, then laughed quietly. That woman had finally understood something I couldn't have taught her with words. Growth doesn't come from winning. It comes from realizing what really matters. I placed the snow globe on the windowsill, where the light hit it each morning. Tiny sparkles of water shimmered whenever the sun touched it. Every time I looked at it, I thought about how far we'd come. It wasn't a perfect family story, but it was real. Real stories have cracks, pauses, and missed moments. They also have returns, reconciliations, and second chances. I learned that love, when genuine, always finds its way home, even if it takes the long road. That snow globe reminded me daily that nothing truly precious ever stays broken. One morning, while I was making breakfast, the phone rang again. It was my daughter-in-law this time. Her voice sounded nervous but sincere. She said she wanted to visit on her own, to spend some time with me, just us. I said yes. When she arrived, she carried a pie she had baked herself. We sat together, eating quietly at first, then talking about small things, recipes, family stories, her childhood. The walls that once divided us started to melt away, replaced by something warmer. Connection doesn't happen through blood. It happens through effort. She asked about my husband, how I met him, and how we built our life from nothing. I told her stories she had never heard, about the nights we went hungry, the times we fought, the days we laughed until we cried. She listened closely, her eyes soft, her hands resting gently on the table. I realized she wasn't trying to impress me anymore. She was trying to understand me, and that, more than anything, made me forgive her completely. Sometimes love just needs context to grow. She finally had it. Before she left that day, she handed me a folded paper. It was a handwritten letter. She said she had written it weeks ago, but didn't know how to give it to me. After she drove off, I opened it. The letter was full of apologies, not rehearsed or fancy, just raw honesty. She wrote that she had been jealous of the bond I had with my son, scared she would never have that. She said she was wrong to think she could replace me. I folded the letter with care, tears falling freely. That night, I placed her letter beside my husband's, 2 letters from 2 different hearts, both trying to do right in their own ways. I thought about how strange life can be, how one act of exclusion had turned into so much healing. I blew out the candle and whispered, "Thank you." I wasn't sure who I was thanking. Maybe God, maybe time itself. I realized then that everything truly worth keeping comes through patience, not control. Peace doesn't rush. It arrives when your heart finally makes room for it. Weeks passed, and my son and his wife began visiting often. They'd help with groceries, mow the lawn, and stay for dinner. The house felt full again. On Sundays, we'd all go to church together. People would smile when they saw us walking in, side by side. I didn't care what anyone thought. I was just grateful for the second chance. Every time the church bell rang, it sounded like a promise fulfilled. Not because everything was perfect, but because love had finally learned how to stay, without pride getting in the way. One evening after dinner, my daughter-in-law showed me pictures of their plans for the river house. She wanted to turn it into a family retreat, with photos of all generations on the walls. I felt my heart swell. She asked if she could have my help choosing the right pictures. I told her I'd love that. We went through boxes of memories together, laughing over old hairstyles and faded colors. It wasn't just organizing photos, it was weaving history back into the present. That night, I felt like my family was whole again. She found one photo that made her pause. It was of my husband holding the same key I had given my son. She touched it gently and asked if she could keep a copy. I told her yes, but only if she remembered the story behind it. She nodded. That photo wasn't just an image, it was a legacy. It reminded me that forgiveness, once given, keeps passing forward. What started as pain had become inheritance. I could see it now in her eyes, in my son's peace, in the quiet joy that filled my home. A few days later, I visited the river house again. It looked completely different. The porch was painted, the swing fixed, and the garden blooming. My son and his wife had turned it into something new, yet it still felt like the same old place that raised us. I walked through each room slowly, feeling the warmth in every corner. It was more than wood and walls now. It was forgiveness made physical. My husband's words from that letter echoed in my mind, "Remind love where it grew." I finally understood them completely. We had dinner together by the river, the sound of water flowing mixed with the soft hum of insects. My son grilled fish while his wife set the table. The smell of smoke and lemon filled the air. I looked at them and thought how proud my husband would have been. He always believed in people's ability to change. I had doubted that once, but not anymore. Love really can rebuild what pride destroys, if you let it. I felt the world settle into balance that evening, gentle and true. When night fell, we sat under the stars, talking quietly. My son asked if I ever felt lonely now that he was grown. I told him no. I said loneliness only lives where love has no room to breathe. My heart had learned how to stay full, even when the house was empty. He smiled and said he understood. Now, his wife leaned her head on his shoulder, peaceful. That image, the two of them under the starlight, felt like the final page of a long story, finally finding its ending. Later, when I went inside to rest, I saw something on the old mantel. It was the snow globe his wife had given me. She must have brought it there without telling me. The light from the lamp made the water inside shimmer. I smiled, knowing it belonged there. The missing base didn't matter. It stood steady, beautiful in its imperfection. It felt like all of us, wounded but whole, changed but still standing. That sight filled me with a quiet peace I hadn't known since my husband was alive. I finally exhaled without holding back. Back home the next morning, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat outside. The air was cool, carrying the sound of the church bell again. I thought about how that bell had followed me through every chapter of this story, marking time without judgment. It never rang louder for good days or softer for bad ones. It just kept ringing. Maybe that's how life works too. It moves forward, steady and fair. No matter what we do, all we can do is listen and keep walking, with gratitude in our steps. The following week, I hosted Sunday dinner again, just like old times. My son and his wife brought dessert, laughing and teasing each other. The house filled with noise. Good noise. The kind that makes walls feel younger. We ate, we talked, and we remembered things worth remembering. Before they left, my daughter-in-law hugged me tight. She said she wanted to start calling me Mama again, but only if I'd let her. I told her she never had to ask. Family isn't something you earn, it's something you build back, piece by piece. That night, I sat alone on the couch, with the candle burning low. I looked around the room and thought about how everything had come full circle. The anger, the silence, the distance, it had all served a purpose. It taught us who we were without each other, so we could learn who we were meant to be together. I realized my husband's letter wasn't about property or blessings. It was about love surviving through generations. That thought made me smile, as I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks before going to bed. The next morning, I woke up early to the smell of rain. It hit the roof softly, steady as a heartbeat. I opened the window and let the air in. The world outside looked washed clean. I poured my coffee, lit the candle, and watched the flame dance against the gray light. I didn't feel old or forgotten anymore. I felt renewed. Life had come back around, just like the river, always moving, always returning. And I finally knew that peace doesn't mean having everything. It means being grateful for what stayed. That day, I walked to the park near my house. The grass was wet from the morning rain, and children were chasing bubbles that shimmered like tiny rainbows. Watching them reminded me of when my son was that small, running wild and free, before the world taught him pride and worry. I sat on a bench and closed my eyes, listening to their laughter. It sounded like forgiveness. Life goes in circles, I thought. Pain gives birth to wisdom, and wisdom gives birth to peace. I felt lucky to have lived long enough to see it. A few days later, I received a letter from the lawyer who handled my husband's estate. It said the trust for the river house was officially released. All legal conditions had been fulfilled. The home now belonged fully to my son and his wife. I smiled at the paper, not because of what it meant in money, but because of what it meant in meaning. The cycle was complete. The blessing once held back by pride had finally reached its rightful hands. My husband's wish had been honored through love, not force. That felt right. I put the letter away and stood by the window for a while. The afternoon light was soft, almost golden. I thought about how strange it felt to see something you once protected finally fly on its own. Maybe that's what being a mother is, guarding something until it learns to guard itself. I whispered a prayer for my son, hoping he would treat that home not as property, but as a promise, a place to remember where he came from. I knew he would. The man he had become made me sure of it. That evening, my son called again. He said they were hosting a small dinner at the river house to celebrate the new chapter. He wanted me there, front and center. I laughed, telling him I'd come only if he cooked this time. He agreed, without hesitation. The sound of his laugh was lighter now, like a man free from guilt. When I hung up, I looked around my little house and realized something simple. It wasn't about where we live. It's about who keeps us company in our hearts. I had everything I needed. The night of the dinner, I arrived just before sunset. The house looked different again. Painted fresh, lanterns hanging from the porch. Music played softly from a speaker. My son greeted me with a hug that felt real, not polite. His wife handed me a plate of food and smiled, the same woman who once smirked at me with pride, now standing humble and kind. I told her she looked happy. She said, "Because I finally understand what family means." Her words were simple, but they carried more weight than any apology could. As we ate, I noticed a small frame sitting on the mantel. It was the photo of my husband holding our son as a baby. Right beside it sat the key, still wrapped in the faded blue ribbon. I asked who placed it there. My son said his wife did. She said the key reminded her that blessings are never lost. They're just waiting for the right hands to open the door again. I nodded, proud of her. I realized she wasn't the same woman anymore. Growth had turned her into something beautiful. After dinner, everyone moved outside. The river shimmered under the moonlight, just like it used to. My son brought out his guitar and played an old song his father loved. I sat back, listening, the sound washing over me like memory turned into music. His wife hummed softly along. I felt tears on my cheeks, but they weren't sad. They were the kind of tears that come when life surprises you with peace you never thought you'd feel again. The night air was cool, filled with laughter, warmth, and something that finally felt like home. When it was time to leave, I hugged them both goodbye. My son told me the house would always have a room ready for me. I told him I didn't need a room to belong. I was already part of it. On the drive home, I looked out the window, watching the trees blur past. Everything outside looked familiar yet new. Maybe that's how healing feels, I thought. The world stays the same, but you see it differently. I reached into my bag and touched the old bus ticket, a reminder of how far I'd come. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I made tea and sat outside, watching the sky turn from gray to gold. The birds were already awake, calling out like a choir. I thought about my husband and whispered, "We did it." It wasn't about proving anything. It was about finishing something sacred. I had kept his promise, carried his blessing, and passed it on. I felt his presence in that morning light, not as a ghost, but as peace itself. I knew he would be proud of what our love had built, even through struggle. As the day went on, I decided to visit the church. Inside, everything looked the same. The wooden pews, the stained glass, the faint smell of wax. I sat in the back, quiet, watching sunlight pour through the colored windows. It painted the floor in reds and blues. I prayed, not asking for anything this time, just giving thanks. For every mistake that became a lesson, for every wound that became wisdom, and for every lost thing that found its way home again. When I opened my eyes, my heart felt light, almost new. Walking home, I stopped by the corner market. Mr. Harlan smiled when he saw me and said, "You look like someone who's found her peace." I told him maybe I had. He laughed and said, "About time." I bought a small candle, the same kind I'd always used. When I got home, I placed it next to the snow globe on the shelf. The two sat side by side, both symbols of survival, one for faith, one for forgiveness. They didn't match, but somehow they belonged together, just like the people who inspired them. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself, fried chicken, greens, and cornbread. I set one extra plate, the way I always did when my husband was alive. It wasn't out of habit anymore, it was out of love. I felt his spirit everywhere in the ticking clock, the flicker of the candle, the comfort in the air. The house wasn't empty. It was full of presence, memory, and warmth. I realized then that some goodbyes never end. They just change shape, turning into reminders of what still lives in us. That's how love endures. Later, I sat by the window, sipping tea and watching cars pass on the wet road. A soft rain began to fall again, steady and rhythmic. I thought of how rain always returns to the same places, no matter how far it travels. Maybe hearts do too. My son had returned. My daughter-in-law had changed. And I too had become something new. Life doesn't erase its scars. It teaches you how to wear them gracefully. I smiled at the sound of rain against glass. It felt like a song only my soul could hear. As night deepened, I looked through my journal and read the first few pages I'd written months ago. The words were full of anger and hurt. I kept reading until I reached the last page I'd written yesterday. It ended with one simple sentence: "I am free." Seeing that made me realize how far I'd come. I didn't need closure from anyone else. I had given it to myself. I closed the book and placed it in the drawer, not to hide it, but to honor it. Some stories are better kept close, not forgotten. The next morning, I went outside to trim my roses. The garden had grown wild while I was busy healing. Thorns had wrapped around the stems, but underneath them were blossoms waiting to open. I put on my gloves and started cutting gently, freeing each flower one by one. It took time, but it was worth it. As I worked, I thought about how people are the same. Growth always comes with a few thorns, but that doesn't make it less beautiful. When I finished, the garden looked alive again, just like me. Later that day, I received a message from my daughter-in-law. She sent a picture of the river house porch. On the swing hung a small wooden sign that read, "The Blessing Home." I stared at it, smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. I could almost hear my husband laughing somewhere, proud of what we'd built. I texted her back a heart and a prayer emoji. Simple, but it said everything. I realized then that blessings aren't meant to be held forever. They're meant to travel, to grow, to live on in others. That night, as I was locking up the house, I noticed the candle still burning on the table. I picked it up and placed it on the windowsill beside the snow globe. The two lights, the flame and the reflection, danced together like old friends. I whispered, "This is for you," to my husband. Then I stood there for a moment, just watching. The glow reflected on the glass made it look like the little river inside was shining. It was the perfect picture of everything we had gone through, light found in brokenness. Days turned into weeks again, each one calmer than the last. I started volunteering at the local shelter, helping cook for families. People there shared stories of loss, struggle, and hope. Listening to them reminded me how connected we all are, even through pain. I didn't offer advice. I just listened. Sometimes that's all people need. One woman hugged me and said my smile made her feel safe. I walked home thinking maybe that was my purpose now, to pass peace forward, just as someone once passed it to me. One afternoon, while walking home from the shelter, I saw a mother holding her child's hand tightly as they crossed the street. Something about that small gesture hit me. It reminded me of how I used to hold my son's hand when he was little. I stood there for a moment, letting the memory play out in my mind. It didn't hurt anymore. It just felt warm. That's when I realized healing isn't forgetting. It's remembering without pain. I whispered a quiet thank you to life for letting me reach this place of understanding. That evening, I received a voice message from my son. He said they were expecting their first child. For a second I couldn't move. Then tears came, happy ones. He said they wanted to name her Grace, after his father's favorite word. I smiled, whispering that it fit perfectly. Grace was exactly what brought us here, through pride, through pain, through distance. I saved that message on my phone, knowing I'd listen to it whenever I needed, a reminder of how far love can stretch when you stop fighting it. I started knitting again, something I hadn't done since my husband passed. My first project was a small baby blanket, soft and blue. Every stitch carried a prayer, every row a memory. As I worked, I thought about the life waiting to be born and the legacy it would inherit, a legacy not of money, but of strength and forgiveness. I planned to gift the blanket at the baby shower, tied with the same faded blue ribbon that once held the key. It felt like everything had come full circle, perfectly and quietly. When the baby shower came, I brought the blanket wrapped neatly in tissue paper. The room was full of laughter and light. My daughter-in-law hugged me tightly, whispering that she was thankful for me every day. I handed her the blanket and told her it carried blessings from both sides of the family. She smiled through tears, saying she could feel it already. Watching her hold that gift, I knew this child would grow up surrounded by love that had been earned, healed, and restored. That thought filled my heart completely. Later, my son stood up to give a toast. He said family isn't about never falling apart. It's about finding your way back together, no matter how long it takes. People clapped, but I just sat there, quietly proud. I looked at the faces around me, each one part of the same story. The air felt soft, safe, whole. My husband's words echoed in my mind again. Bless those who forget you, for they will remember you twice. I smiled. He had been right all along. Sometimes love needs distance to find its way home. After the party, I stayed for a bit to help clean up. My daughter-in-law insisted I take leftovers, and I pretended to argue, but I packed them anyway. When I was leaving, she stopped me at the door and said, "Thank you for never giving up on us." I touched her hand and said, "It's easy not to give up on people who were meant to be yours." She smiled, her eyes full of tears. In that moment, I saw not the girl who excluded me, but the woman who learned to love deeply. That night, when I got home, I placed the blue ribboned box, now empty, back on the shelf. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely. I brewed some tea, sat in my favorite chair, and looked around at everything that had changed. I thought of my husband, my son, and the new life soon joining our family. I realized that every ending I had feared had just been another beginning waiting in disguise. I smiled and whispered, "We're all blessed now." The candle's flame flickered once, then steadied, like it agreed. The next morning, sunlight filled my kitchen like a warm welcome. I brewed coffee and looked at the photo on the wall of my son and his wife, smiling at the river house. That picture wasn't just decoration. It was proof that love can survive its own mistakes. I thought about everything we had gone through and realized I no longer felt resentment, not even a trace. The story that began in silence had found its voice, and it spoke peace, Sometimes the loudest redemption comes not from words, but from how people choose to live afterward. Weeks later, my son came to visit again. This time alone. He looked thoughtful, more mature somehow. He said he'd been thinking about everything we'd learned, how hard forgiveness had been, but how freeing it felt. He thanked me for not turning bitter, for showing him what strength really looked like. I told him I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because love isn't supposed to stop when people disappoint you. It's supposed to stretch. He smiled and said, "Then I hope my daughter grows up to be like you." That moment stayed with me. The seasons began to change again. Autumn painted the trees outside my window with gold and orange. I spent my days knitting, cooking, and writing small notes to tuck into the baby's blanket. Each note carried a lesson about kindness, patience, courage. It wasn't just a gift, it was a map for her to grow by. I imagined my husband looking down, proud of how far we had come. Life had taken us through storms, but we'd found our way back to calm waters. That thought filled my chest with something warm and steady. As winter came, the first snow fell one quiet evening. I stood at the window, watching flakes cover the streets. The world looked peaceful, untouched. I thought of the snow globe on my shelf and smiled at the resemblance. I realized how symbolic it was. The world keeps shaking, but beauty still settles when you stop fighting it. That was my life. Now. Not perfect, not still, but balanced. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, feeling the soft weight of gratitude. Healing had become my rhythm, and I was finally moving in tune with it. When Grace was born, my son called me from the hospital. His voice trembled with emotion as he said she was healthy and beautiful. I could hear the tiny cries in the background, and it made my heart swell. He said they wanted me to be the first to meet her. I dressed quickly, hands shaking but smiling the whole time. On the way there, I kept thinking about my husband's words, about blessings that travel through generations. I realized that little girl would carry the love we had built, the proof that forgiveness truly lasts. At the hospital, the first thing I noticed was her tiny fingers, curling around mine like they already knew me. She had her father's eyes, her mother's lips, and something gentle that reminded me of both. My daughter-in-law looked tired but radiant. When she handed me the baby, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I whispered a small prayer over her, the same blessing my husband once said over our son. The nurse smiled softly, and I smiled back. I knew that in that moment, every wound had finally healed. When I got home that night, I placed a new photo on my table, me holding baby Grace. It joined the others like it had always belonged there. I lit my candle again, the same one that had burned through everything, and whispered, "We've made it." The flame flickered softly, reflecting in the snow globe beside it. I thought about how every object in that house told part of my story. The box, the key, the candle, the letter, all of them threads of a tapestry woven from pain and patience. And now, it was complete. The following week, I visited the river house again. My son had invited me to see the nursery they'd set up for Grace. The little room faced the water, with sunlight spilling across pale yellow walls. Above her crib hung a framed quote that read, "Home is where love remembers." I ran my hand along the crib rail and felt tears rise. My daughter-in-law came up beside me and said she wanted Grace to grow up, knowing her roots, her blessings, and her people. I nodded, speechless but full of pride. The cycle had renewed itself. We sat on the porch later that day, sipping sweet tea and talking about everything ordinary: laundry, weather, family. My daughter-in-law leaned her head on my shoulder, comfortable now. That simple gesture meant more than any grand apology ever could. I thought about how far we had both traveled emotionally, how we had started as strangers bound by love and ended as family bonded by grace. The river flowed nearby, calm and steady, reflecting the orange sky. I understood then that peace isn't something you chase, it's what finds you when you stop running. That night, I stayed in the guest room, unable to sleep from happiness. I walked through the hallway, looking at family pictures on the wall. My son and his wife had filled the house with memories that included me. My husband's old ring hung in a shadow box, beside a photo of the day we rebuilt the porch. Underneath it was written, "For every broken thing made whole again." I smiled through tears. That was our story in one sentence. Proof that what was once fractured had become the foundation of something lasting. The next morning, I woke to the smell of pancakes and laughter coming from the kitchen. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching my son flip pancakes while his wife held the baby. The scene felt like déjà vu, like seeing my younger self with my husband, only now through new eyes. My son noticed me and smiled, saying breakfast was almost ready. I sat down, heart full. Family doesn't stay the same. It grows, reshapes, and still finds its way back home. The house that once divided us now united 3 generations. Later that day, we took a walk down to the riverbank. The air was cool, and the water shimmered under the sunlight. My son carried the baby, and his wife held his arm. I walked a few steps behind, just watching. They looked like hope itself, proof that life keeps moving forward, no matter how many times it bends. When they turned around to wait for me, I realized I didn't need to catch up. My place was right there, behind them, watching what love had built, and knowing my work was done. When I got home that evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table. The candle flickered softly, the snow globe catching its light. I thought about all the people who might never get closure, who might live their whole lives waiting for an apology that never comes. I wished I could tell them that peace doesn't always arrive in the form of words. Sometimes it comes through moments, gestures, or quiet understanding. I smiled, thinking how life had given me all 3. That was more than enough for one heart. The days passed peacefully. I received pictures of baby Grace every week, her first smile, her first nap, her tiny hands clutching the blanket I'd made. Each image felt like a small miracle, proof that love doesn't fade when shared. I began writing letters for her future, one for each birthday, filled with lessons about family, forgiveness, and faith. I sealed each one with care, ready to pass them on when she was old enough to understand that blessings aren't inherited, they're lived. I wanted her to know she came from love that had survived storms. On Grace's first birthday, they invited me to the river house again. The place looked more beautiful than ever. Balloons hung from the porch, laughter filled the air, and the smell of cake drifted everywhere. My son handed Grace to me as the guests sang. She clapped her tiny hands and giggled, her joy contagious. I held her close and whispered the same words my husband once told me, "Always love without fear." That was his gift to me. And now it was mine to her. The blessing had passed on, pure and whole. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind to help clean. My daughter-in-law thanked me again for everything, saying she wanted Grace to grow up exactly like me. I laughed and told her that all I wanted was for Grace to grow up knowing her worth. That's the real inheritance of our family. She hugged me tightly and said, "Then she already has the best teacher." I didn't have words after that. I just held her hand, letting silence say everything that needed to be said between 2 women who had finally found understanding. When I returned home, I noticed the candle on my table had burned all the way down for the first time. I didn't replace it. I just smiled, knowing it had done its job. The flame may have gone out, but the light remained in my home, in my family, in the hearts it had touched. I sat in the quiet, letting the peace sink in. I realized that some endings aren't losses, they're completions. My story wasn't about pain anymore. It was about legacy, the kind that keeps glowing long after the flame rests. A few weeks later, I planted a tree in my backyard, a small oak, strong and slow-growing. I tied the same faded blue ribbon around its trunk. Every time the wind blew, it fluttered softly like a memory waving hello. That ribbon had traveled through every chapter of my life: love, loss, forgiveness, rebirth. Now it would live in the open, feeding new roots. I stood there for a long time, hand on the bark, whispering a thank you to everything that had brought me here. The ground felt solid beneath my feet, like peace itself. Spring arrived again, bringing fresh air and blooming flowers. The oak tree had started to grow small leaves. I sat outside most mornings, coffee in hand, watching it reach upward. Birds built a nest on one of its branches, and I took it as a sign. Life continues no matter how many times it bends or breaks. I felt my husband's presence in the breeze, my son's laughter in the distance, and my granddaughter's future in the rustling leaves. Everything was connected, every ending just another doorway waiting for love to walk through. One afternoon, I found myself going through the drawer where I kept old keepsakes. I came across my husband's letter again. The paper had yellowed, but the words still felt alive. I read the last line one more time. When love forgets its roots, remind it where it grew. I smiled, whispering, I did, love. I folded it carefully and tucked it back into the box. It no longer felt like a relic. It felt like proof that promises made in love never die. They just live differently, through the hearts that remember them. Later that evening, my son called again. He said they were planning to name their second child after my husband. My throat tightened with emotion. I said that was the best gift they could ever give me. He laughed softly and said, We're just keeping the circle going. After the call, I sat by the window, the sunset glowing through the trees. I whispered to the wind, telling my husband the news. I could almost hear his voice in the rustle of leaves, saying he always knew love would lead us back to grace. That night, I dreamed of the river house. The water sparkled under moonlight, and the house looked just as it did years ago, simple, strong, full of life. I saw my husband standing on the porch, smiling, holding out his hand. But he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I felt his message in the calm around him. He was at peace, and so was I. When I woke, there were tears on my pillow, but they felt like blessings, not sorrow. The dream didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like home. The next morning, I walked to the church again. The bell rang as I arrived, clear and steady. I lit a candle in the front row and sat there quietly. I prayed not for myself this time, but for everyone who carries a burden they think they can't set down. I prayed they'd learn what I did, that love heals faster when you stop keeping score. When I left the church, the sunlight felt warm on my face. It was the kind of warmth that stays, even after you step back into the shade. Back home, I made tea and stepped onto the porch. The air was calm, the oak tree swaying gently in the breeze. I looked up at its growing branches and thought of everything that had come from one act of forgiveness: my son's family, my granddaughter, the peace inside me. It all began the day I decided to love without conditions. The river in my heart had stopped raging. It flowed smooth now, carrying blessings instead of bitterness. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, knowing my life had found its perfect rhythm at last. That evening, I sat in my chair one last time, candlelight glowing soft against the walls. The room felt warm, filled with echoes of laughter, love, and memories that would never fade. I thought about my journey, from pain to peace, from being forgotten to being remembered. I whispered a quiet thank you to time, to faith, and to the love that never gave up. Outside, the bell rang again, its sound drifting gently through the night. I smiled, feeling everything come full circle. The story wasn't ending, it was simply resting in grace.